Hi everyone, Asim here again, your host and founder of Healingclouds. Today we're with Bryan Smith. He's an ex-wellness professional, pro sports performance coach turned repeat founder and startup advisor. He's also the co-founder of Leon. Welcome, Bryan.
Hey, thanks for having me on, man. Super excited.
Thank you for coming. Before we get into all the questions, Bryan, perhaps let's kick it off by a little bit more about you and the reason behind Leon.
Yeah, sure. So, my story is somewhat varied. I don't come from a traditional sort of tech background, by any means. I grew up in a sort of very poor family, was in a lot of trouble as a kid, which eventually sort of found me going into the military. I don't put that on my LinkedIn just because I don't really like to sort of bring it up much, but went into the military. And the military was really the first time in my life that I ever experienced any sort of success in something, right? But also the first time I ever experienced any sort of discipline. And really that discipline revolved around self-discipline, right? Like getting up to run in the morning or getting up to, train for your job or whatever that is, and just sort of achieving something, right? I was in the Army Reserves actually. So, I was in then, unless I got out of basic training, that's when I went to university. I went to university for exercise science. And then I started learning about this idea of sort of, instead of optimizing myself, about optimizing other people, right? Through sort of exercise physiology and, mental health and all these other things. And then eventually led to me working with professional athletes. So I worked with professional athletes ranging from track and field. Where are you at, by the way? Are you in India? Or are you in London? Okay, gotcha. Yeah. I worked with a bunch of athletes from all over the world. Actually, in the Rio Olympics, I had 17 different countries representative athletes that I worked with. And with sports science applications, right? So we did blood analytics, we did EEG and EMG monitoring, we did GPS monitoring, all these things to ultimately predict performance or predict injury in professional athletes, right? On like a 4-year period or even 8-year period, depending on injuries and whatnot. That eventually progressed from sort of optimizing athletes to wanting to get into optimizing human beings, right? And optimizing sort of our workforce, which eventually led to me starting Leon. And what Leon is, we're an employee performance platform. So we do things we predict things such as burnout, mental health issues, performance issues, and culture issues before they ever happen. But instead of like sort of your normal employee engagement software, we give that information to the manager to make changes. We actually create AI-driven, what we call playbooks for each individual employee in a company. So if we see that someone's burning out, we'll point specific services like Healingclouds or massage or yoga or whatever that is directly to that individual. Company will pay for the services, obviously, but it will give them the exact services they need to be able to sort of fix their issue. Then we develop learning modules, custom events, all these things ultimately designed to really build sort of badass, robust employees. Because we understand that if you build a robust employee, then you build a robust company.
So it's really bespoke to the employees as well, because obviously every employee is different, every individual is different. So the employee can then choose the type of services that they want in that particular month.
Correct. This is all biology, right? Everything that an athlete and an employer are no different. We still receive stress and we still have stress responses. That's what we look at. We look at it as like an N=1 approach, where we're going to give your employee exactly what they need when they need it, so they can sort of own their own care to a certain extent. And for a company, they don't have to guess, right? They don't have to guess the best way to sort of optimize their employee or treat their employee. We tell them exactly what they should be spending their dollars on, and the best way to help every individual within a company.
And Bryan, talking about pro athletes and your experience with pro athletes, what would you say is the relation between, their physical health and their mental health, and how important is the alignment between mind and body?
I would say it's so important that there is no difference to a certain extent, right? Like where you're familiar with this idea of complex systems theory?
Absolutely.
Right, where you have multiple inputs, right, that influence the system. And that's really all we are, is we're all just one big biological symptom. And if you take into account stress, physical stress and mental stress, your body perceives it as the same input, right? It's the same thing. It's either a eustress or a de-stress to the individual. So they either adapt positively or they adapt negatively. So, for example, if I tell you to run a 400 meter in, a minute 47 seconds, that's going to stress the hell out of you, right?
Yeah.
But if I tell you to scale your company 10x over the next 30 days, that's going to stress the hell out of you. So it's still a stressor. What we need to do from a company perspective, and you and I are sort of on the forefront of this, we need to build sort of robust employees that are able to handle that stress mentally, physically, emotionally, and all those other things. Because again, stress is no different. It's just stress, no matter what type of stress it is.
Talking a little bit about that, because you perhaps deal with a lot of companies, because a lot of companies are now using your platform. What gaps do you see in the workplaces, and what changes do these companies need to actually do to reach that kind of level?
It's the workplace is. It's a functional system, right? Which is ever changing and sort of ever evolving. It's almost biological to a certain extent. Yeah. But in the workplace, we're sort of stuck in this realm of legacy, sort of like Ford Motors sort of applications of the way we manage our employees and we run our employees. And also like the Google effect, right? Like the open sort of startup culture, and culture is everything and all these other stuff. But I feel like there's an area in between, right, where we're sort of working into this concept of like the modern worker, and COVID has sort of accelerated that, right? Where I think what we're missing now is the idea that people need to be great for themselves, not just for the company. So when companies are spending dollars, like L&D, like learning and development, is a huge thing, right? Like I might want to just learn how to cook. I might want to learn how to build a deck. But that makes me a more robust, happier human being. And those are the things that I think companies miss the mark on, is they make these decisions when they're better for the company, but they don't actually make these decisions if they're better for the human being that just happens to work for that company.
And, talking about COVID, obviously, you spoke about us being on this legacy system, and then, us trying to replicate what Google is doing, or any other, these big tech startups that we know of. But what, in your opinion, has COVID or this whole pandemic changed in the short term or even the long term? What sort of changes do you see and foresee?
Yeah, so, obviously we're in a situation where I think companies are understanding the overall well-being of their employees, right? Where mental health and physical health and stress management and burnout, like these things are on the forefront. And they're on the forefront because we don't get to interact with our employees on a daily basis anymore. So we don't have that quote unquote pulse of our workplace or environment now. So now that we understand that, since we can't manage via conversation or taking out for a cup of coffee or whatever it is, we now need to manage the human being, right? And from afar, that makes complete sense, because we understand that when employees are sitting at home, we have all these other stressors that are coming in. And as companies, we have to figure out a way to mitigate those type of things, right? So yeah, I think ultimately we're just becoming more aware that there's actually people that run our company and that work for us, and that we need to treat them as such and not just capital, I guess.
And do you think with that mind shift, do you think employers are going to be much more empathetic post-COVID, post-pandemic?
Yeah, I guess let me ask you, how should we be running our companies? And you and I are founders, right? So it's a debatable type thing. But the way I look at it is, I want less manager intervention. I almost want less conversation to a certain extent, right? I want to be able to manage my team with empathy, give them the sort of schedule and time, the resources they need to ultimately build work around their life. I think if I can do that, then that's really all that matters to a certain extent, right? If they're able to sort of live their life as well as help my company grow, ultimately that's what we should be striving for, right? I think we get so caught up in this idea of like culture. And what I mean by culture is, you did you work in a company before?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
So the last thing that I ever wanted to do was go to the company happy hour on Friday night.
Yeah.
I never wanted to do that, right?
Yeah.
Or the mandatory but not really mandatory company 5K on a
Yeah.
Sunday afternoon, right?
I couldn't agree with you more.
You know, and those type of things, you know, we had this overreaction where we're managing so much on sort of like culture and like what you add to the environment and all these other things, where maybe we should be managing more in just performance, right?
Mm.
Where, you know, I'm not going to give you any shit. I'm not going to deal with you at all regarding how much you talk to your employees and how involved you were in the Zoom meeting and all of these other things, or if you went to the happy hour or not. You know, I'm going to let you sort of run your life, live your life, however you see fit. I'm going to give you your sort of KPIs, and that's it. And then just manage off of that. In my world, that seems so much easier.
Absolutely.
Than everything
Absolutely.
else, right?
Absolutely.
But maybe I'm different, and I guess that's what we'll figure out.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, ultimately, I think this whole, you know, clock in, clock out, 9 to 5 culture needs to die anyway, because it should be on those KPIs, which helps you not micromanage to start off with. You know, your sanity is in check. Everybody else's sanity is also in check. And then I think people also become that much more productive when you give them that ownership and you give them that trust. So I think it, you know, your mind shift helps them shift the whole perspective of, you know, what they really are there to do. So I think that ultimately is a game changer. Do you think at least, if not, you know, we spoke about legacy companies, but at least startup founders, you know, more so are thinking in this direction these days, or?
Yeah, I do. But I think what ends up happening is they probably overreact once they hit a certain level of scale, right? Where now they try to insulate everything and they try to bring everything sort of inside, and they set KPIs for anything possible, right? And culture becomes such a big thing. So yeah, I think there's a middle ground on it. I think as startup founders, it gets really hard, right? Because you got to think of the level of stress that a startup founder is on. You and I raise a Series A or Series B or Series C. You know, we're no longer answering just to ourselves.
Correct.
You know, we're now answering sort of to our investors. So it becomes a much different environment, which quite honestly probably has a little bit more stress than your legacy type company. You know, legacy type companies are hard because there's a lot of bureaucracy, which sort of drives the stress down onto employees. But within, you know, high growth startups, you know, now there's expectations, and then a lot of times founders put those expectations onto their employees.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you know, being a fellow founder as well, so I completely resonate in obviously what you're saying. In terms of stress levels for founders, what do you do for your own stress, and what would you advise other founders for their stress? Because it is a very high stress, you know, position that we take on board on ourselves. So, what do you do, and what do you advise?
Yeah, so you know, I try to stay away from recommendations in a lot of ways because we are also very different.
Yeah.
And the way that I manage my stress is completely different than the way that someone else manages their stress. You know, but I think it's being aware of as far as what stage of stress that you're in and what system of stress is dominant at the time, right? You know, so if you look at two branches of, and you're familiar with all this stuff, the two branches of the sort of autonomic nervous system, right? You're either sympathetic or parasympathetic. All right. Most of the time during sort of short stressful times, we end up being more sympathetic dominant. We're in that sort of fight or flight response. And then what happens to founders as well is a lot of times we get so stuck in that sympathetic state that we end up in a constant state of recovery. So we end up being parasympathetic dominant, which is where you sort of really get into that long-term burnout state, right? And in that long-term burnout state, you get in these ideas of not being able to sort of rise up to the occasion, no emotion, no, like, you know, you almost sleep too much rather than sleep less. So there's like a continuum there, right? So I think you have to understand as far as where you're at. You know, I think from an athletic perspective, when we saw that an athlete was sympathetic dominant or in fight or flight response, we understood that we had to take intensity away from them, right? Because any intensity would put them higher into that sympathetic state. So I think if a founder is feeling sort of agitated or has that sort of like nervous energy type feeling, something that is going to be parasympathetic in nature, right? So it's going to be low intensity, but maybe higher volume. So, walking outside in a park is going to be fantastic. Lower intensity cardio, even foods that are low acidic in nature would probably be fine. Sometimes alcohol is even fine at that point. What else? Sauna recovery is fantastic. Light massage is fantastic, right? Because all those things are sort of bringing someone down more into a parasympathetic state, right? Because you're ultimately trying to maintain that balance.
Correct.
Right. But also therapy. I think therapy is a great intervention there because it helps someone sort of actualize and achieve some level of self-awareness as far as where they're at and how to bring themselves down. So yeah, I think it's just understanding where you're at, and ultimately the stimulus that your body needs at that time is probably the most important thing you can do, whatever that is, right? So again, if it's running, if it's jogging, if it's massage, if it's therapy, that's up to you, but it's just being aware.
You're right. I mean, one size doesn't fit all. Obviously, we're all different people, but there are obviously so many things out there which one can try. And if it works for you, by all means, continue. But like you said, balance is the key as well. So as long as we balance things out, what is the trajectory now for Leon? Where do you see Leon going, and what is the exact aim, focus, vision?
Sure. I would say that the first thing that we look at is we want to be an anti-fragile company, to bring that book up that I brought before, right?
Yeah.
So we want to be one of the first ever lifestyle SaaS products, right? Because if you think about our product, we're an employee advocate product, right? Like we always want to make sure that we're making decisions that are always good for the employee and not the company, even though the company's paying for our product.
Sure.
But we need to draw a line in the sand, right? And it's really hard to be that company that tries to make both parties happy. So first, we want to be an employee advocate company first and foremost. Now, to be an anti-fragile company, it's important that you don't just have one product or you don't rely on one thing, right? So that's why brand is so important to us. So I think right now what we want to do is really refine our brand and just sort of have that sort of trickle into different aspects of business. If it is a private community, like our humans community, if it is our singular product, which is Leon, but also potentially, events and, collaborations of some sort, and just trying to really be where the employee lives and where the human being lives instead of just solely living within the workplace.
That's amazing, Bryan. It was, fantastic talking to you today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Where you've come from and where you're going. But before I leave you, if an employer wants to get in touch with you, how can they reach the company? And also for individuals, if they want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Sure, you can go to our website, myleon.co, so .co. It's probably the best place to go. Be honest, I don't even know my LinkedIn handle, so I would say you can go there. But I'm sure you can find it.
Hopefully they can. Yeah, hopefully they can. Hit your name on the search.
They'll maneuver and figure it out. But
yeah,
I think the biggest thing about us from a brand standpoint is that we're an honest company. We are brutally honest to a certain extent, and sometimes it does hurt us. But we believe in transparency. We believe in sort of truly helping people, even if it does take away from the growth of our company. So.
And I think that is extremely important. So, hats off for you guys for doing that, and stick to your guns.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, man. Take care.
Thank you so much, Bryan. Pleasure talking to you.